Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Olha, and I want to greet all of you here in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. It's been 9 years of the war and the second year of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And today we invited you to discuss a very important topic, the illegal sentencing of Ukrainian prisoners of war by the quasi-courts in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. I would like to introduce our speakers today. They are Olha Reshetylova, coordinator of the Media Initiative for Human Rights, Bohdan Pantiushenko tanker, who was captured in early 2015 and released in January 2019, and Andrei Yakovlev, expert of the Media Initiative for Human Rights and a lawyer. So on 10th of March, a court of so-called Luhansk People Republic sentenced a well-known Ukrainian journalist and human rights activist Maksym Butkevych, who with the beginning of the full-scale aggression joined the armed forces of Ukraine and went to the front lines to defend our homeland, just as a lot of other of our defenders did. Unfortunately, he was captured, and on the 10th of March we were seeing the sentence of 13 years in prison. Other Ukrainians such as Viktor, Pohozei and Vladyslav Shel were also sentenced. And today we will be talking why such processes are going on and why Russia wants to have this quasi-courts. What does it tell us about and how can we react? Please, Miss Olga. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I understand the concern and pain that Ukrainian society feels when we all see those sentences for Ukrainians. It's natural for us. Every such person is valuable to us, and us as the society, we are concerned with the destiny of each of them. But I would like to say, probably not, let's not get so concerned about those courts, about those sentences, because they are purposed to exercise pressure on us. It's one of the instruments of pressure of Ukrainian society. We probably don't know, but maybe there are some negotiations underway about exchange, or that's yet another attempt by them to grow the price of our prisoners of war, to have better negotiation position during the prisoners exchange. But it's not a new story. We observe such sentences since 2014, since the beginning of the aggression against Ukraine. Our media initiative, as a part of the initiative 5 of Ukraine 5 a.m. So we started studying these cases about those quasi-courts. They were a part of our research, and one of the co-authors, Andrei Yakovlev, is the co-author of this study. He will tell you more about the legal part of the matter. So we were observing those practices since the very beginning of the war, and we were understanding clearly that with the hands of those quasi-creations, Russians were doing something they don't want to do back in Moscow. We know the cases when the servicemen were sentenced to death, the Ukrainian servicemen. We don't know about any executions, however, we remember about the sentences. But again, we remember that after the 24th of February, they were trying to do the same in Mariupol. There is moratorium on death sentence in Russian Federation itself, and condemnation of conviction of the prisoners of war is prohibited by the Geneva Conventions, but they are trying to do this with the hands of the so-called DPR and LNR. All those sentences, by their cruelty, they look terrible. For example, serviceman Voskoboynik was sentenced to 30 years in prison back in 2018, and Bohdan, currently present with us, he spent 5 years in Russian imprisonment and he was released in 2019. However, he was sentenced to 13 years. So I won't try to calm down the Ukrainian society, because those sentences are legally nil and void and they mean nothing for the further destiny of the servicemen. It's just that they will be left alone, they will be stopped to be pulled to the interrogations, to the court proceedings. Bohdan may tell us a few more words about that, but about their liberation, their release, it doesn't influence those processes in no way, because Ukraine, just as well as all the civilized community, doesn't consider those court proceedings and the sentences as something real and serious. So this is the introduction. I would like to pass the microphone to my colleagues. Well, Andrei, let's tell about any legal grounds for those court convictions, for the awards, and how should Ukraine react to that, and how it is perceived by the international community from legal point of view. Good afternoon. I think that the reason for those sentences is a part of the strategy, which can be divided in two parts, is the internal consumer and external consumer. Every part which is a part of every party which is a part to an armed conflict, well, they convict us in the, or they accuse us in war crimes, the violation of the laws of war, and this is how they want to demonstrate that they found some facts of war crimes. But can we trust at least a little bit to those court awards, and how should our country react to those challenges? I think that we should communicate it correctly, first of all to the external consumer, that those convictions have nothing to do with the war crimes, and even if we don't analyze it, for example, there is information in the mass media that Butkevych was in other place at that moment, but by just external indicators we may say that those convictions are illegal, and the fact of it is the war crime itself, or maybe even crime against humanity. Why? Because we can take into account whether those judges which were convicting this or that person, were they independently elected? No, they were appointed by the occupational administration. We know what was the procedure. Were there convicts? Did they have any chance for defense? No, there was no, because there was no external spectator who would be able to observe those procedures. For example, Geneva Convention contemplates such a procedure. There may be Red Cross involved in this process as an independent organization which could confirm what was going on during that court proceeding. But again, everybody who was convicted in DPR, they all recognized their fault. So in fact, they accused themselves, and we cannot confirm whether they were doing it on a voluntary basis, and we have grounds to assume that they were tortured, they were forced to produce those recognitions. And we've heard that there is the administrative practice applied in the territory of DPR. In fact, you have been convicted, there is a court proceedings, quasi-court proceedings, which is deprived of any indicators of justice, and the court is the continuation of the executive power, executive authority. So here we see the violation of the right to the just court, which is a war crime, and the wide, broad scale application of such procedures is the crime against humanity. And it's enough for us to state that this court, like Olga mentioned, they don't do it in Moscow, because there would be more grounds to say that the judges were appointed in a different way, but they don't bring our people to Moscow. They convict them in the occupied territories. However, we have to react that it's not a war crime, and secondly, the fact of their conviction tells us about a huge problem, crimes against humanity, and finally, why they cannot do it from the legal point of view. The prisoners of war, like one of the parties to the conflict. I'm saying conflict not because I'm afraid to say war, because war is being declared. But the word conflict is something that can be used under the international humanitarian law, which we refer to, saying that there was a war crime in place. So application of those procedures says that in this case they commit war crime, and they keep doing it on a broad scale. And to wrap up my thought, I would like to say that a party can keep the prisoners of war until the end of the conflict, but where the war crime is committed, they can keep it after the end of the armed conflict, and this is how they reinforce, so to say, legally, to keep them in their premises until the end of the conflict, but in fact they commit crimes against humanity. Bogdan, Andrei mentioned that everybody who is convicted by those quasi-courts, they recognize their guilt, but maybe you will be able to tell about this best, that like it's most likely that those recognitions are being beat out of people are being tortured, and how should we treat it? Because looking at those videos that the occupiers record for us with our heroes, with our warriors, why should we treat it in a different way? Well, I want to start from the very beginning. I'll get back to the year 2014 to understand how that situation with the course came to what it is now. Back in 2014, when we started getting problems, when Russia started capturing our territories, many of our guys started getting imprisoned, but back then there were agents of influence, but they had no centralized power. There were a lot of different units acting at their own will. There were some teams of Givi and Motorola and Cossacks, and that was an anarchy back then, and everybody was keeping the prisoners of war in the ways they were wishing it. The field commanders were exchanging them right in the fields, well, negotiating with our commanders. I'm talking about the so-called DPR, but in LPR, more or less the same thing was happening. Then there was the beginning of fight for power, and their protege Alexander Zakharchenko won that war, and everybody who did not want to submit, they were eliminated, and the members of those organizations are in prisons, in confinement cells. Someone is already 6 feet under, someone is isolated. So anyway, Zakharchenko won, and they created so-called people's police, and this is the manner of Russia. They know that those lands they occupy in Georgia and other regions, those fake republics, they cover it with the so-called state administrations. They create state administrations which are necessary to function as the separate country, separate state. So this is what happened there. When Zakharchenko took the power, they started thinking about what to do with the prisoners, because the issue moved from local level to the central level. There were lists of the prisoners of war on the tables of the leaders of the most advanced countries of the world. most developed countries of the world, and back in 2015-2016 they started bringing the prisoners of war in a centralized manner. They started implementing some rules of behavior, rules of handling the prisoners of war, and the format of prisoners of war they had to add it to the context of criminal legislation, criminal code. And they incriminated the articles of terrorism, assistance to terrorism, and they started the interrogations. There were different bodies taking, different authorities taking part of all those actions, but in the end of 2017 it all moved under the office of General Prosecutor, and they started interrogation of all the prisoners and hostages. They were all moved to the confinement cells, and within 1 year each and everyone underwent some interrogations, and there were court proceedings, and they were transferred to the colonies. Well, so how do they achieve to have all those evidences produced by our warriors, and how do they make them accept those convictions? What is the procedure of those court proceedings, and how do those videos emerge? Well, I would like to just end the issue with isolation. They just beat the acknowledgement out of you. You either get killed, or you're not even get killed, you get tortured to death. They do it perfectly well. So, and you sign whatever they give you to sign. There is no real choice. But for those in the confinement cells, and those who end up in the office of Prosecutor General, well, you can try to protect yourself there, but in the end it will result in nothing. For example, I was sentenced to 18 years. I did not acknowledge my guilt, but it did not change anything. In fact, I was coming to interrogations, and the investigators were asking me some stupid questions. They made a report which was like a lot of pages thick. So he was acting, in fact, as a writer. He was writing whatever he wanted. So there is, and then I was convicted for 18 years. In fact, it's a circus life going on. This is how it happens there. There is no real legal process. I think that they just need the vision of the activity of the government administrations, the vision of the fact that all those government authorities operate. Well, let me add a little bit about the tortures, why it is considered that you cannot rely on any acknowledgement of the guilt which was beat out of you. It's not because it's anti-humane, but there is a position that says that during certain intensive influence on the people, all the people will be forced to say what they need, and it only depends on intensity of this influence. So any acknowledgement which is acknowledgement of guilt which was produced under such pressure, such acknowledgement is not accepted throughout the world. So this is how we should treat it. Olha, the question will be to you. The question is simple, but it would entail a complicated answer. What should the human rights organizations do to influence the situation and to liberate Maksym and other convicts? Well, if we remember about Maksym, we already mentioned it in the statement of Coalition 5 AM. Maksym is our friend and our colleague, and everybody who knows Maksym, they understand how absurd all those accusations are, because he was the one who confessed the principles of humanitarian law, and I'm sure that Maksym only stands for the good of the civil population. and no one was taking care of it more than Maksym during this conflict. So the fact that he was convicted for those facts is another confirmation of absurdity of those processes. And it's interesting that they mixed up those three cases, two cases from Mariupol, another from Severodonetsk. I don't know why Maksym is with Azov servicemen, because they tried to smear the Azov servicemen for a long time, and there is a global campaign for liberation of Maksym now because he was a civil rights activist, and it was important to smear his name too, that they wanted to smear him in the same way that they smeared the names of Azov servicemen. It just explains their logic, how they work, how they mix the righteous with the sinful, and they impose all those fakes and create that fog. Like the global community should get confused and they should lose understanding of it, because my first reaction was to not to react to it. But on the other hand, if you don't react to it, if you don't explain the global community and the world media what's going on, then this is when those misunderstandings emerge, and some may seem like the Ukrainian human rights activist was able to commit war crimes. It's impossible, and it only proves the absurdity of it all. And apart from the fact that we should explain to the global community about what we can do, let's not forget that there is a lot of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civil hostages are imprisoned too. And talking about the prisoners of war, there is at least a framework of the Geneva Convention on how we can act. We see the exchanges going on from time to time, and we appreciate all the efforts of the Ukrainian government, who during conflict going on, they take a very active stance as to liberation of the Ukrainian prisoners of war. Maybe not as fast as we would like to. It's still a lot of them, and we would like to have more and more of them liberated. However, still something is going on, and we have to keep pressing on the international community to take more efforts to the liberation of Ukrainian prisoners of war, and we should demand from the International Committee of Red Cross to intensify their position, at least as to the access to the Ukrainian prisoners of war, because currently nobody has access to them. That's yet another violation of international humanitarian law. Russia does not allow any access to the Ukrainian prisoners of war. We don't know how they are being kept, in what conditions. Sometimes the letters are being passed through the Red Cross within half a year. We had actually cases when the letters, which were written back in May, were received by the relatives in September, October, and there was only one phrase like "I'm alive, I'm healthy," and that's it. So Russia keeps violating Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law on a systemic basis, and we have to engage any mechanisms to force them to comply with their obligations. Andrei, from your point of view, are there any mechanisms that can be engaged by the international community to control what's going on with the prisoners of war? Obviously, there are mechanisms, and we see it on the example of Azov servicemen. They were going to convict them while they were sitting in the cages. So the international community pressed and influenced them, which that did not happen. It's a good signal. It's a positive signal. We have to communicate those cases in a proper way, that those are not war crimes. And why? Because I already told you, inside we have to communicate all those matters in the correct manner too, not only in the territories controlled by Ukrainian government, but also to the territories beyond government control. For example, their investigation committee disclosed some situation about some witnesses, so it means that people witnessed about the war crimes of that same Butkevych, which means that their evidences were not true, unfaithful, so we have to investigate it via criminal means. Why is it done and how it's done? We have to punish the guilty ones, and to prevent these things from happening in future, we have to initiate criminal proceedings to check it. They print the information who was engaged on this website of the Central Investigation Committee. And the other thing is we have a lot of occupied territories, and now some of those territories were liberated, so we can check for the examples there that people were forced to provide evidences against former prisoners. And the more territories we liberate, the more we can develop these procedures. So first we have to communicate those cases properly, and we have to investigate those circumstances of those criminal procedures to punish the guilty ones for the future or now, and then give a signal to those who get engaged in the occupied territories to such quasi proceedings that they know about their responsibility. Thank you. I want to thank you, and dear colleagues, if we have any questions on the floor, we can proceed. Good afternoon, Ukrinform. Since we mentioned Red Cross here, we would like to ask the following. May the Red Cross to a certain extent influence the condition of the prisoners of war, specifically those who were convicted? And do they have any mechanisms of influence? At least you mentioned that they can hand the letters to the closed ones, to the relatives. And what exactly can they do to improve the situation with the prisoners of war? And another question is, previously, Ukrainian Helsinki Community and Human Rights said that there is in fact more prisoners of war, the Ukrainian prisoners of war, than we imagine. Do you agree with this opinion? What is the number of Ukrainian prisoners of war, in your opinion, according to your evaluation? And wouldn't the condition of Ukrainian prisoners of war deteriorate if they are not registered as prisoners of war? They are being captured but not registered as prisoners of war, and how should we liberate them? So I will probably start with the last question. As to the number, yes, this number is quite big. I am not going to disclose what we know, and I think it kind of makes sense. There is a logic in order not to demoralize the Ukrainian society, and it's legally prohibited, in fact, to disclose any such information. So let's not focus on the figures. Let's talk about the scale of the problem. We have a lot of prisoners of war. The last ones whom we exchanged, they were coming from Irkutsk, so we have to understand that they are being spread about all of the Russian Federation. We have to gather information where they are, and it allows us to control the situation and not to lose anybody of them, because it's important not to lose any single one of those thousands of names. And also I want to emphasize that everybody will be released. We work on this as the human rights community, and the Ukrainian government works on that, and that should be a clear message to all the closed ones. For example, wife of Bohdan, she was waiting for 5 years. She worked actively on his coming back. They have a happy family now. So we have to talk about the bright future which is about to come. It's important to believe in it, and we should not get too much focused on the figures. It's still a lot of work to be done. Those lists are very important to us, and the relatives, they need to control this process too, so no one gets lost, no single name is forgotten. As to what do we know about the cases that you mentioned? Yes, we had a couple of cases like that, when at least some units of Russian army were detaining our servicemen, and they did not report about their detention. They were keeping them in some spaces. They were giving them phones to get in touch with their families and to demand to extort money from them. So I know about the case when one of the servicemen was kept separately. He was told that no one knows about him, and if the relatives don't transfer money, they would kill him. So it took us a lot of time to report about his detention, and for the time being he is on our list. He's being requested on our part, but we have no confirmation about his detention from Russia so far. It's important to receive those confirmations from Red Cross, and this is where we proceed to your next question. The minimum that the International Committee of Red Cross can do is to demand Russian Federation to confirm the detention of our servicemen. And this is the guarantee for us that, first of all, a person is alive, and if their names are confirmed, so Russian Federation is liable, is responsible for the situation with his life, with his health. And in some cases it seems to us that sometimes RCRC is not so active with us. We understand that Russia violates any rules. It's difficult to have negotiations with them, but the activity of international organizations, I'm not only talking about ICRC, there is the United Nations Human Rights Committee, Human Rights Mission. So I hope that UN mission already works on getting access to those servicemen who were convicted. At least we know about those 3 cases. We don't know about other ones who could be convicted. It's just something that we know based on the reports of the investigation committee of Russian Federation. So this is what the international organizations should do. They're providing access to them, to the prisoners of war. So only the pressure of international community can help us in doing this. I see Andrei wants to add something. Yeah, I agree with everything that was mentioned. I also want to mention about some systemic capabilities. The international humanitarian law, what we call the laws of war, it's used to limit the methods of war. The handling of prisoners of war is the method of war, and there is such a thing as ICRC or fostering state. It sounds archaic, but it's actually a mediator, and the function of such mediator, if there is no such country, the may be exercised by ICRC, and there should be agreement of both parties for them. And in our cases, when ICRC communicates with the Russian Federation, they have reputation crisis because we condemn it. We say that they play on that side, but we have to take into account that Red Cross is a very useful institution. They're the only ones who have access to our prisoners of war, and we need to use that resource because there's a lot of things that we can do, and sometimes we don't have such an opportunity as the connection between the prisoners of war and the external world. And sometimes the prisoners of war are being contacted, and this is by an advocate, is the confirmation that that person is not being tortured, not being beaten, and so on and so forth. So we have to communicate with the world, so that the Red Cross takes this function of the mediator to exercise those humanitarian things like the confirmation of imprisonment and ensure communication with the world, which contemplates not only telephone connection or mail connection, but transfer of some small packages, and this is the minimum what we can do. I would like to add about one question as to the figures. It's an important question, but there is a small nuance that not in the context of the not only prisoners of war but hostages as well. Russia has such an option that they can pick an indefinite number of people from the occupied territories and convict them of anything. So we shouldn't get tied to that figure as something stable. So we do our job, the people keep changing, and And this is the victory of Russia, because their resource is indefinite as to the figures. As to the Red Cross, in my opinion, based on my practice, based on my experience, they're kind of a lame organization which have a lot more resource that they use. They are very inefficient. They can be a lot more efficient. It's difficult to them to talk to the Russian Federation, and they don't really care a lot about that. They can bring the letters and the packages on the monthly basis. They can be efficient, but they should be pressed on from all sides, because when you press on them, they start moving. Thank you, Olga. So let's finalize our meeting. So what's the top priority for you to get Maksym and other prisoners of war currently released? What are the steps you're about to take? Well, first of all, we work with the families of the prisoners of war, and we call them to get united, and a number of civil organizations is already created that get united around the units or where those servicemen originate from, or maybe some episode where many servicemen were captured. So it's very difficult for one family to find the ways to find information, so we accompany them. We have regular meetings with the coordination headquarters for release of the prisoners of war, with the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights. We meet with different international institutions. We try to bring up this issue to the most extent possible. We show different episodes of capturing of our servicemen so that we compose them in one single episode, so we understand all the movements. We try to track all their movements, where they are located, because Russians now move them around different facilities, and so this is what we do. Well, it's clear that it may not be enough, and you never know what works in this or that case, but we try to engage different channels, different contacts. Just like Bohdan mentioned about the civil hostages, that's yet another issue, because there is no mechanism for their release, and as of the last week our organization identified the location of 1075 citizens of Ukraine, and not only citizens of Ukraine who were captured in the occupied territories. They were detained. Well, sometimes the world confuses the deported people, and we're talking here about the civil hostages who are being kept together with the prisoners of war, and their detention is not being confirmed by the Russian Federation. And if they are confirmed, they say that they were detained for the counteraction of the so-called special military operation. Well, we do our constitution, we exercise our constitutional right and our constitutional duty that we counteract the armed aggression against our homeland. Well, and this figure is not final, because it's very difficult to obtain any information from the occupied territories. In very frequent cases in Kherson region, people were detained in families, and there was no one left to report about them missing, about their detention. So the next step is the development of the mechanism for release of the civil hostages. So we keep working. Maybe Andrei has a couple of words. Well, I will add, what can the journalists do? First of all, they can document the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, because, you know, for the war crimes there is no expiration of the term for liability, and the journalists like you or other members of the journalist community may be engaged in documenting those crimes, because they can be evaluated later. I call to this. We have a question, if you need it.
Security media. You actually asked my question right there, which is, what can journalists do? But the second part of the question is, are there things journalists should not be doing or should be cautious about doing? For instance, I stay in touch with the Mariupol families who are waiting for news. And every time I write to them, say, did we get news today? and they did not get good news, I always think about that emotion of bad news being reinforced. But do you think of things that journalists should maybe be cautious about? Yaku.
Thank you very much for this question. Yeah, this is very, maybe, I will switch into Ukrainian, yeah, okay. Дуже важливо справді журналістам.
For journalists, it's really very important to remember how they produce the information. For example, lately there was a very interesting experience how the journalists try to identify the name of the executed prisoners of war, and how they were chasing in those attempts to do this. They inflicted pain to some families because there is a family behind each and every name that lives through it, that is concerned about it. This is the very important moment. Us as the human rights activists, we work with the interest of those who were affected, and we understand what they went through, and we're going through it together with them. And again, about the statistics, for example, we as a media organization, we have a lot of journalists working with us, and we had a discussion recently when we were writing about a secret Russian prison, Bryansk confinement cell number 2, where, according to our information, there are 640 Ukrainian citizens detained, and our journalists wanted to provide a percentage, which is the percentage of the criminal proceedings, I mean for Ukrainians, in relation of Ukrainians, and we came to the conclusion that statistics is not important there. The fact is important, because if even one person is detained, it's already a war crime, but if it's made on a broader scale, that's a crime against humanity. But in any case, every life matters, every family matters for us, and I want the journalist community to take this into account too. Well, they do it, but in some cases, right, we have to remember about the interests of the families, and what the journalists should do is OSINT investigations, use their sources of information. For us, it's important to identify the location of those people and pressing on Russia to identify, to confirm where the prisoners of war are or civil hostages are. Andrei, please. And I would like to add that when we say about some coverage of any circumstances, any events, we have to understand that the prisoners of war, they are protected against curiosity of the public, and it's the violation of the norms of a humanitarian law if they say the curiosity of the crowd is one of the translations. The curiosity of the public state wording may be used, and is different. It's difference between war crime and curiosity. If we focus on the description of the war crime, we will maintain this balance because investigation of the war crimes is the responsibility of the government. And what war crime is the international crime, and international crime and is the crime against the world order. And every country which is a part of the international community should investigate such crimes, because those are the crimes against those countries, each of them. And the journalists, they publicly exercise the function of monitoring of authorities, and they can describe it, but it shouldn't be done out of curiosity. Thank you. Thank you. We have more questions.
The 2 soldiers who've been sentenced along with at the same time just now, recently, are they the first soldiers from Azov who've been charged and sentenced for war crimes? And so last summer, as you mentioned, we were all expecting this huge war crimes trial from Russia that was going to sentence all the people from Azov. It didn't happen. But do you think there will be more trials of people from Azov in DNR LNR, so-called trials? And the second question, Ukraine has also sentenced some Russian soldiers for war crimes. Have any of those soldiers been exchanged? And would you think it would be acceptable if they were exchanged for people who've been sentenced by DNR LNR?
I will start and then give.
Перше питання щодо чи перші це наші військові.
So the question was, are those the Azov servicemen were they the first ones to be convicted? And another question was about the Ukrainian party. We also convicted the Russian prisoners of war, where they exchanged later. Well, for what I remember, those were not the first sentences for the servicemen of Azov, because those courts, those sentences that they were going to produce back in summer, they just didn't make it in a public manner. We have quite limited access to this information. I cannot give you the exact number, but there were previously sentences for the servicemen of Azov. That's no new practice. Those are not the new sentences. Those sentences are being produced on a constant basis. There is a report in English which you can get familiarized with. We described how that quasi-legal system was established and how they were doing it. So we can expect more such sentences, more such proceedings, and I consider them as an attempt of pressure on the international community, on the Ukrainian community. And another question as to the Russian servicemen which were convicted in Ukraine. Yes, we track it constantly as the civil rights organization, and according to our information, there were people exchanged who could potentially commit the war crimes, but there were no sentences against them. If you remember the first proceedings concerning Shashamarin, who was evidencing, who was witnessing against his commander, that his commander gave him an order to execute a civil person, but that commander was exchanged before, so he was not brought to liability in Ukraine within any court proceedings. And unfortunately, there is no common responsibility phenomena in Ukrainian legislation, so our courts can only bring to liability those servicemen, specific servicemen, without the context of who was given the order to whom. And there was another case of exchange of a pilot. I will not call his name now, but he was exchanged. There was a court proceedings initiated in his regard for bombardment of Chernihiv and Kharkiv. Unfortunately, he was exchanged and he was not convicted in Ukraine. So we understand that Russian Federation has a lot more interest about such characters, and they're being requested for exchange more frequently, because obviously they're not interested to having those people brought to liability in Ukraine, and because they can be brought to liability not only in Ukraine but in the International Criminal Court too, and this is why Russians are very interested in having them exchanged. I will continue just a little bit. For what I know, I was communicating with the prisoners of war, with a prisoner of war recently. He was returned from Mariupol, from 36th Brigade. They are not Azov, but they are still defenders of Mariupol, and I know that Russians try to gather any information about the cases where the military could have been in contact with the civil population. Maybe they do it to get some proofs about improper handling of the civilians. So they keep investigating, they keep interrogating people, they keep torturing and beating them. So their case is not yet over. They try to systematize it. And as to our sentences, we not only we have an obligation to investigate in compliance with the international legislation, but I want to mention another aspect. When we sentence something of the war crime, those convictions, they tell something about the violation of the laws of war, and there is a question about the trust to such conviction. So I want to support the proposal of my colleagues who say that we should create the intermediate course, the hybrid course with the foreign judges involved, because so that no one can say that is the court of the winner. We should develop more trust to our sentences. We have more questions there.
Будь ласка.
People who have been sentenced in a Ukrainian court for war crimes, would you think it's okay if they were exchanged? I'm talking
what do we think about it? You know, when we have so many prisoners of war, which we need to get back here, I think after the sentenced, I think they can be exchanged. I don't know. This is my opinion, but we have to ask victims of those criminals. What do they think? Because the interest of victims is also very, very important.
Розумієте, наші військовополонені сидять.
Well, you understand, our prisoners of war, they don't sit in the prisons of the European Union, and everybody knows how they are being treated. There were a lot of European court awards that even them being convoyed along the territory of Russian Federation, that can be equalized with the war crime. Well, there is a last question.
Yes, a few weeks ago, a little over a week ago, Evgeny Prigozhin put up a video that had 3 people that were in the video that were supposed to be from Bakhmut. And it raises the question of, have you seen in the last year the use of video where they force confessions or force prisoners to make comments? Because this is one of the types of war crimes that are, documented. And not so much as how many, but have you seen enough to say it's a problem, or is it something not as much? Because I don't see a lot of them, and I was sort of expecting to see a lot of them. And that video the other day sort of raised that question. Дякую.
Я теж не можу вам зорієнтувати.
Could you please repeat once again about the video? What was the video about?
Yeah, so in the case of the Prigozhin video, they had three people in the building, top of the building in Bakhmut, north of Bakhmut. And he said, well, here are 3 men who were fighting, and they were forced basically on video to say, hey, President Zelensky, come save us or let us escape. So they were used as part of propaganda model. So do we have in the last, just specifically this last year, or if you want to say over the last 9 years, use of video to force propaganda from prisoners?
Чи стикались ви з такими?
Використання prisoners of war, військовополонених для пропаганди.
Have you seen such videos as the pressure on Ukrainian power? Because this gentleman, the journalist, he gives an example of the video of Ukrainian prisoners of war who addressed to Zelensky. Well, maybe Bohdan may answer. Well, yeah, there are some facts that I saw present, that I saw by myself. I spent some time in prison, and there were more prisoners coming to us, and they were coming to us with, say, two papers with the text written on them, and they were saying to this or that prisoner, like, yes, it was back in the time when Alexander Zakharchenko was in the office, so they had those people, those prisoners of war, learn what was written in those papers, and then they were forced to go on the next day somewhere. Those people who were imprisoned, they were tortured, beaten, then they were brought to the center of Donetsk to some monuments, and different journalists communicate with them, and sometimes it happens that people answer some provocative questions because they just don't know how to answer properly, but sometimes they are being forced to learn those quotations. And let me add a little bit. The prisoners of war, according to the Third Geneva Convention, they can be detained, and that's the only thing that they can do. Other rights are being kept by the prisoners of war, and they are protected against the curiosity of the crowd that I mentioned already. And when they are already being subjected to the curiosity of the public within the framework of the propaganda, it says about the serious violation of the rights of such persons, and we have to pay attention first of all to this, and media should say, like, listen, you use a person, it's the inhumane handling, it's inhumane behavior, and propaganda is yet another thing that follows it. But first of all, it's about the human rights. You cannot act like that to a person. And in fact, this is the war crime committed. We see the European Court award. It says the administrative practice, and we cannot trust the courts. What Prigozhin does, those are all manipulations, and we have to say that this is a crime. We have not to spread this information, because one of the tasks is to spread this information. For example, you spread this story, you shared this story with us, and it keeps spreading, but we have to emphasize that it violates the rights of the human rights. And well, I have another small remark. We have the witnesses from the liberated reconnaissance serviceman. He was kept in Sevastopol. He was captured with a heavy wound, and within 1 week he was not provided any medical aid. He was cruelly tortured, and since he was an officer that was a demonstrative place of detention, and Moskalkova, the Commissioner for Human Rights of Russian Federation, was coming there, and this Mykola, that's his name, he was forced to say on camera that he is being provided all the necessary medical aid, that he is handled properly. So it's not only propaganda, it's the huge government system. There is a fake imprisonment, fake Commissioner for Human Rights, which gives somebody the image that it can be accepted as some civilized handling. Dear friends, thank you for the interest to this topic. Olha Reshetylova, Bohdan Pantiushenko, and Andriy Yakovlev were joining us, and I think we will keep this under control to have all of our defenders come back home. NGOs, civil rights activists, the government, all of us Ukrainians, we will fight for each and every Ukrainian who is currently imprisoned in the temporarily occupied territories or in Russian Federation. Thank you, bear with us, and glory to Ukraine.